What if one of Hollywood's toughest icons walked into a friendly morning show, expecting nothing more than a light chat, only to discover the cameras were primed for a verbal ambush? Picture this: a studio built for comfort, suddenly humming like a pressure cooker, lights that were meant to flatter, now sharpening every glance into a spotlight of suspicion. Sylvester Stallone, a man who has turned decades of bruises and triumphs into cinematic legend, arrives ready to share stories of grit, perseverance, and the kind of wisdom only a lifetime of fights on and off screen can teach. But across from him sits George Stephanopoulos, a seasoned interviewer whose background in hard politics hides beneath the sheen of television charm. Behind that trademark smile flickers something else: intent. While the audience anticipates nostalgic anecdotes and motivational soundbites, George has quietly loaded a different set of questions, ones aimed not at Stallone's new movie, but at the man's beliefs, choices, and the power of celebrity itself. It's a collision waiting to happen, and when two veterans of very different arenas meet under live lights, even a single misplaced word can ignite a fire no producer can contain. Times Square was barely waking when Stallone's black SUV slid to a stop outside the Good Morning America studio. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and bright studio lights, a space built for comfort and easy conversation. Producers bustled with clipboards, makeup artists whispered last-minute touch-ups, and every crew member carried the relaxed rhythm of a segment designed to sell a movie, not spark a debate. Stallone stepped through the doors like a man who had done this 1,000 times, broad shoulders squared beneath a perfectly cut leather jacket, a faint grin hinting that even at 77 he still owned every room he entered. He'd been briefed: a few light questions about the new action flick, a sprinkle of nostalgia about Rocky and Rambo, maybe a quick laugh about staying in shape. Nothing political, nothing personal, nothing to draw blood. Across the set, George Stephanopoulos waited with the easy charm of a veteran host, his trademark half-smile hiding years of sharp political instincts. To the casual observer, it looked like any other morning chat. But beneath the bright lights, subtle cues betrayed, a different energy, camera angles adjusted twice, producers exchanged silent nods, and George's eyes carried a glint of anticipation that suggested this interview would be anything but routine. What Stallone couldn't see from his comfortable chair was the quiet choreography that had unfolded long before he arrived. Hours earlier, George Stephanopoulos had been in his office, scrolling through a carefully curated stack of notes, headlines, and half-forgotten quotes. The veteran journalist wore the reputation of a polite morning show host, like a well-tailored suit, but beneath it still pulsed the instincts of a political strategist. His years in the White House had trained him to spot weakness and craft questions that landed like precision strikes. While the producers rehearsed camera cues and practiced cheerful intros, George sifted through decades of Stallone interviews, hunting for sound bites that could spark debate without crossing a legal line. He wasn't looking for a cheap tabloid moment. He wanted something bigger, an exchange that would trend across timelines, ignite talk shows, and remind viewers that live television can still produce unscripted lightning. In his mind, this wasn't an ambush so much as a public service, a chance to test whether Hollywood legends should be held accountable for the influence they wield. By the time Stallone walked onto the set, George had trimmed his list to 3 deceptively simple questions. Each was wrapped in the polite phrasing of morning television, but each carried a fuse. One careless answer could detonate into headlines before the credits rolled. The segment began exactly as Stallone's team had predicted, a textbook exercise in morning show warmth. George greeted him with a handshake and that famous camera-ready smile, the kind that made millions of viewers believe they were witnessing nothing more than a friendly catch-up between two professionals. The studio lights softened every edge, bathing the set in a golden glow that promised comfort instead of confrontation. Stallone settled into the plush chair, shoulders relaxed, answering the first round of questions with practiced ease. He spoke of the grind of filmmaking, the lessons of perseverance learned from a lifetime of underdog roles, and the thrill of seeing a new generation discover his classics. Audience members behind the cameras nodded along, clapping at the right beats, feeding the illusion that this would remain a nostalgia-soaked love fest. But subtle signs betrayed the coming shift. George's follow-ups grew tighter, more specific, and a fraction quicker than the usual morning banter. Producers in the control room exchanged quiet glances, aware that their host was steering the conversation toward deeper waters. Stallone, ever the veteran, sensed the tempo change. His eyes narrowed slightly, his posture straightened, and the faint grin that had charmed the crowd began to fade. Tiny tells that the fighter inside him recognized an opponent circling for the real bout. Then it happened, the almost imperceptible pivot that separates a friendly interview from a sparring match. George leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees, voice still calm but sharpened with the precision of a seasoned interrogator. He prefaced the question with a disarming compliment about Stallone's influence on American culture, praising the perseverance and patriotism celebrated in his films. But the compliment was merely a runway for the real payload. Without missing a beat, George asked whether Stallone believed celebrities carried a dead responsibility to remain politically neutral, especially when their words could sway millions. The studio temperature seemed to shift by degrees. Applause faded into an uneasy hush, and even the steady hum of the cameras felt louder in the silence that followed. Stallone's eyes locked on George's, with the steady focus of a boxer measuring distance before a counterpunch. He didn't flinch or fidget, but the small adjustments, a slow inhale, a tightened jaw signaled that the question had landed exactly as intended. Crew members behind the lights exchanged subtle glances, aware they had just crossed from safe entertainment into unpredictable territory. What had started as a comfortable morning chat now carried the charged stillness of a ring just before the first bell. For a heartbeat, the studio held its breath, the quiet stretching long enough for viewers at home to feel the tension crawl through their screens. Stallone broke the silence with a slow, deliberate exhale and a faint tilt of the head, the kind of gesture that said he'd heard this challenge before and knew exactly how to handle it. His voice, gravelly yet controlled, rolled across the set with the weight of decades spent in front of both cameras and crowds. "I've played a lot of fighters," he began, "but I've never believed in pulling punches when it comes to honesty." The words were calm, almost conversational, but each syllable carried a steel edge. He explained that fame might give a platform, but it doesn't strip a person of their citizenship or their right to speak. Whether you're an actor, a host, or someone watching from their living room, the freedom to share an opinion is part of the deal. As he spoke, Stallone's posture remained steady, shoulders squared, gaze unbroken, a visual reminder of the resilience that had defined both his characters and his career. A few audience members nodded instinctively, sensing the quiet power in his restraint. Yet beneath that composure, a spark of challenge flickered, hinting that the next exchange would test whether George was prepared to push even harder. George absorbed Stallone's reply with a polite nod, but the slight tightening around his eyes betrayed that he wasn't satisfied with a clean, dignified answer. Years of political skirmishes had taught him that the most effective follow-up is the one that feels casual while aiming straight for the ribs. He leaned back just enough to signal calm, then tilted the conversation toward influence and consequence. "But Sylvester," he said, keeping his tone light, "when someone of your stature speaks, it's not the same as a neighbor sharing thoughts over coffee. Your words ripple through millions. Don't you think there's a duty to weigh that impact before speaking?" The phrasing was careful, almost gentle, but the subtext landed like a challenge. Your freedom of speech carries a price. Producers in the control booth exchanged quick looks, fingers hovering over the commercial break button in case the dialogue veered off the rails. The studio audience sensed the shift too, the collective silence broken only by the faint creak of a camera operator adjusting position. Stallone's eyes narrowed a fraction, his jaw tightening as if bracing for a punch he knew was coming. Instead of rushing to defend himself, he let the moment stretch, using the quiet as a countermove. The pause itself became a statement, an unspoken reminder that silence can be more commanding than 1,000 rehearsed lines, and that he would dictate the pace of this verbal fight, not the man across from him. The pause stretched long enough for viewers to lean closer to their screens, expecting a sudden burst of anger or a sharp retort. Instead, Stallone finally spoke with the unhurried cadence of a man who has survived both real punches and the relentless theater of Hollywood press tours. "George," he said, voice steady and low, "I respect the reach of this platform. I respect that words can travel faster than fists, but responsibility isn't the same as silence." Each phrase landed like a measured jab, controlled, precise, impossible to interrupt. He explained that influence is a byproduct of hard work, not a license that comes with a gag order. People listen because they believe you've earned a perspective, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest to the fans who built the very stage you stand on. As he spoke, his body language told a second story. Shoulders squared, elbows resting lightly on the armrests, he projected the calm menace of a fighter who knows he can absorb the next blow and still counter. A faint ripple of applause rose from the studio audience, quickly smothered by nervous producers worried about taking sides. George's practiced smile held, but the twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed the pressure building beneath the surface. The sparring match was no longer theoretical, it was live, unscripted, and escalating. George's smile lingered, but a sharper energy now threaded through his posture. He shifted slightly forward, clasping his hands as though tightening a mental grip on the conversation. Years in political war rooms had taught him that control often comes not from volume, but from the careful placement of a single, barbed question. "So, if influence comes with no strings," he asked smoothly, "would you say anything is fair game? Even if what you say fuels division?" The wording carried a velvet coating, yet the core was unmistakably pointed, an accusation disguised as curiosity. The audience inhaled in collective suspense. Some leaned toward Stallone, others toward George, like spectators picking sides before the bell rings. Camera operators steadied their shots, aware that one explosive exchange could become the clip replayed across every network by afternoon. Stallone tilted his head, eyes narrowing in thought, and for a heartbeat, the set felt like a boxing arena locked in the moment before impact. Instead of rushing, he let the silence stretch, a tactic that forced George to hold his gaze and the audience to sit in their own anticipation. Every creak of a swivel chair, every faint hum of the overhead lights, amplified the tension until the air itself seemed to vibrate. When Stallone finally drew a breath to speak, the studio leaned forward as one, waiting to hear whether the Hollywood legend would deflect, retaliate, or drop a line destined to echo far beyond the morning broadcast. Stallone finally broke the charged silence with a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who has spent a lifetime proving doubters wrong. "Division isn't born from words," he said evenly. "It's born from the fear of them." The phrase sliced through the studio like a clean right hook, calm, deliberate, but impossible to ignore. He leaned forward just slightly, enough to show engagement without conceding an inch of ground. "People don't need me to tell them how to think. They need me to be honest, even when it's messy. If that stirs debate, good. Debate is how a free country breathes." His eyes never left George's, and the host, for the first time, seemed to hesitate. Producers in the control room whispered to each other, torn between cutting to commercial or letting the tension play out. The studio audience responded with an involuntary murmur, a ripple of energy that betrayed whose words had landed hardest. Stallone pressed on, explaining that his films, whether about underdogs in a boxing ring or soldiers surviving impossible odds, have always celebrated resilience and personal responsibility. "I'm not here to hand out orders," he added, his tone firm but not hostile. "I'm here to remind people they have the right to stand up, to think, to fight for their own truth." The message resonated like a bell, leaving George momentarily silent and forcing everyone in the room to recognize that the actor's greatest strength wasn't just muscle or fame, but an unshakable commitment to speaking without fear. A subtle but unmistakable shift rolled through the studio as Stallone's final words settled over the crowd like an unexpected storm. What had begun as a morning chat now pulsed with the electricity of a live showdown. Audience members exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to applaud or hold their breath. Some leaned forward in quiet admiration, others sat rigid, caught between the thrill of confrontation and the etiquette of a live broadcast. Behind the cameras, a producer mouthed a silent countdown to the control room, fingers hovering over the commercial break trigger in case the exchange veered beyond network comfort. Even the lighting seemed to harden, every spotlight sharpening the lines on Stallone's face and catching the faint tension in George's jaw. George cleared his throat, a small sound that echoed louder than expected, betraying the pressure of the moment. He tried to summon the easy charm that usually disarms guests, but his voice carried a new tightness when he finally spoke. "Strong words," he said carefully, "but do you worry that passion can sound like provocation?" It was meant to be a neutral bridge, a path back to safer ground, yet the question only highlighted the high-stakes atmosphere now gripping the set. Stallone gave a slight, knowing smile, the kind a seasoned fighter wears when he senses the crowd shifting in his favor. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of resolve as the broadcast edged further from scripted television and deeper into the raw territory of live, unfiltered debate. George, searching for a way to reclaim the narrative without appearing confrontational, reached for a touch of pop culture levity. "You know," he began with a faint, calculated smile, "Spider-Man once said, 'With great power comes great responsibility.'" The line floated into the studio like a lifeline tossed across stormy waters, an attempt to wrap a heavy debate inside the comfort of a comic book reference. But the move landed with an unexpected thud. Stallone's eyebrows lifted, a flicker of disbelief cutting through his otherwise composed expression. He let the silence linger, just long enough for the audience to feel the awkwardness stretch. "Did you just quote Spider-Man at me?" he finally asked, voice carrying a dry humor that drew a ripple of nervous laughter from the crowd. The question wasn't loud or mocking. It was a carefully aimed counterpunch, exposing the tactic without granting it authority. George maintained his smile, but a faint flush crept across his cheeks as the tension tightened again. Stallone leaned back, allowing the smallest grin to play across his lips. "Great line," he added. "But responsibility starts with asking real questions, not hiding behind superheroes." The audience erupted in a low, stunned murmur, some clapping before remembering they were part of a live broadcast. What was meant to soften the exchange had instead sharpened it, turning a playful quote into the very spark that reignited the verbal boxing match. The unexpected humor cracked the tension like a sudden bell in a silent ring. A few audience members couldn't resist open laughter, their chuckles spilling into the microphones despite frantic hand signals from floor managers. The sound rippled through the set, breaking the polished morning show veneer and revealing the raw human energy underneath. Stallone used the moment like a veteran fighter spotting an opening. He allowed the grin to linger, then added, "I love a good superhero story, but in the real world, responsibility isn't about costumes, it's about courage." The line drew another round of spontaneous applause, louder this time, as if viewers sensed that the guest, not the host, now commanded the room. George kept his posture measured, but the faint tap of his index finger against his cue cards betrayed a flicker of irritation. He countered with a soft chuckle and a quick pivot, asking if Stallone worried that bold statements might alienate fans who come to him for entertainment, not ideology. Stallone's reply came with the steady rhythm of someone who refuses to be cornered. "Fans know authenticity when they see it," he said. "They've watched me fight uphill battles on screen for decades. They don't need me to hide behind safe answers to enjoy a movie." The crowd responded with approving murmurs, a living soundtrack to the shifting power dynamic. In that instant, the studio no longer felt like George's domain. It felt like Stallone's arena, a space where candor had overtaken scripted politeness and every word carried the charge of unscripted truth. George inhaled slowly, steadying himself as the applause tapered into a restless buzz. Years in politics had taught him that when an opponent seizes momentum, the best counter is a carefully framed question that sounds neutral but demands a risky answer. He adjusted his tie a subtle stall and then asked, "But doesn't honesty sometimes collide with responsibility? Isn't there a line between speaking your mind and sparking unnecessary conflict?" The query was smooth, polished, and dangerous, designed to reclaim control without sounding adversarial. Stallone regarded him with the quiet patience of a man who has heard every variation of that challenge. "Conflict isn't born from expression," he replied after a deliberate pause. "It's born when people stop listening." His voice carried a low resonance that filled the studio like the rumble of distant thunder. He spoke of decades in Hollywood where scripts could be rewritten but character had to remain unshakable, and how the same principle applied to public discourse. "Responsibility isn't silence," he continued. "It's standing by your words and facing the consequences, good or bad." The audience responded with scattered applause, each clap underscoring the shift in loyalty that now hung palpably in the air. George offered a practiced smile, but the faint tightness around his eyes betrayed a recognition that the balance of power had tipped decisively toward the guest. What was meant to be a controlled interview had evolved into something unpredictable, and the man known for delivering knockout performances was quietly winning a very different kind of fight. The studio's polished calm now felt like a live wire, every second buzzing with the awareness that the interview had crossed into territory no producer could fully contain. George shifted slightly in his chair, searching for the poised authority that normally kept guests in check. But Stallone's steady gaze made every small movement feel magnified, as though the cameras had zoomed in on the tiniest cracks in the host's composure. Determined to regain footing, George leaned forward with a softened tone. "I respect that perspective," he said carefully. "But many would argue that influence brings an obligation to avoid statements that could be misused." The hesitation before misused betrayed the difficulty of framing a question that sounded concerned rather than censorious. Stallone allowed a measured pause before responding, his gravelly voice carrying an even weight. "The misuse of words belongs to the people who twist them, not the ones who speak honestly," he said. "If we let fear of distortion silence us, then the loudest voices will always be the ones with nothing real to say." A quiet murmur of approval rolled through the audience, punctuated by a few bold claps, despite frantic signals from the floor crew to keep reactions muted. The control room debated a break, but each passing second made cutting away feel like surrender. George managed a thin smile, but the sparkle of easy confidence was gone, replaced by the careful calculation of a man realizing that a conversation meant to challenge his guest had instead exposed the limits of his own authority. By now, the atmosphere inside the studio had shifted from quiet anticipation to something closer to a championship bout. Each exchange between George and Stallone drew subtle but unmistakable reactions from the live audience. Tiny gasps, muffled laughs, a rising tide of murmurs that betrayed where their sympathies were leaning. A woman in the second row clasped her hands tightly, eyes fixed on Stallone with the look of someone silently cheering an underdog. A man near the back crossed his arms and shook his head at George's latest question, his expression caught by a roaming camera just long enough to flash across the monitors in the control room. Producers whispered urgent instructions to maintain neutral crowd shots, but the momentum had already escaped their grasp. Stallone, sensing the shift, didn't gloat or press the advantage. Instead, he spoke with the measured cadence of someone who knows the crowd's energy is a weapon best wielded quietly. "We don't grow by pretending disagreement doesn't exist," he said, letting his words roll through the space like slow thunder. "We grow by facing it head-on and walking away with respect intact." The statement earned a ripple of applause that swelled despite frantic hand gestures from stage managers. George forced a practiced smile, but the faint tremor in his voice when he replied revealed the uphill climb he now faced. What had started as a controlled interview was becoming a live referendum on authenticity, and the audience had already begun casting their votes with every clap and murmur. Behind the glossy set, the control room buzzed with the frantic energy of a team watching their carefully scripted segment unravel in real time. Monitors flickered between camera angles, each revealing a live audience leaning ever closer to Stallone, their expressions carrying the unmistakable thrill of witnessing something unscripted. A producer barked for a timed cut to commercial, but the director hesitated, aware that interrupting now would look like surrender and ignite even more chatter online. Stage managers on the floor gestured wildly for the audience to stay neutral, their signals ignored as another spontaneous wave of applause rolled through the studio. Stallone remained steady in his chair, eyes fixed on George, with the calm intensity of a fighter who knows the final rounds belong to endurance. George shuffled his cue cards, searching for a path back to safe territory, but every planned segue suddenly felt flimsy against the raw tension filling the air. He tried a half-smile and leaned towards Stallone, voice carefully measured. "Some would say this is exactly why celebrities avoid politics," he offered, hoping to pivot toward a neutral wrap-up. Stallone answered with a subtle grin and a slow shake of his head, an unspoken signal that he wasn't interested in soft landings. The cameras captured every twitch, every exchanged glance, and the crew knew the clip was already destined for viral circulation before the segment even reached its next break. Even as the conversation unfolded under the hot studio lights, the outside world was already reacting in real time. Viewers at home began clipping segments from their DVRs and posting them across social platforms, each upload carrying a headline more dramatic than the last. Within minutes, hashtags like #Stallone Showdown and #Morning Ambush trended on X, TikTok, and Instagram. Short clips of Stallone's Spider-Man quip racked up thousands of views before the segment had even finished airing, with comments ranging from admiration for his calm defiance to outrage at what some called a gotcha interview. Influencers stitched the footage into reaction videos, offering instant analysis and replaying Stallone's sharpest lines with slow-motion emphasis. News blogs rushed to draft quick takes, speculating on whether George had crossed a journalistic line, or whether Stallone had masterfully hijacked the narrative. Inside the control room, staffers monitored the digital wildfire on side screens, watching engagement numbers climb faster than any morning show segment in recent memory. The viral momentum only heightened the tension on set. Every word now carried the weight of a breaking news headline. Stallone seemed aware of the real-time spectacle, offering a brief, knowing glance toward the cameras, a silent acknowledgement that the fight had already expanded far beyond the walls of the studio, and that the audience outside was growing by the second. As the commercial break finally approached, a low chime signaled the countdown that producers hoped would usher in relief, yet the studio remained charged with the same kinetic energy that had fueled the confrontation. George shuffled his cue cards again, searching for a closing line that might reclaim authority, but the expressions in the audience made it clear that the balance of power had shifted permanently. People whispered across rows, their faces lit by phone screens, as live updates from social media confirmed that the outside world was already dissecting every second of the exchange. Stallone, still seated with effortless composure, glanced toward the crowd and offered a small nod, acknowledging their presence without overtly courting their approval. The gesture drew a fresh ripple of applause that producers tried in vain to dampen with frantic hand signals. George forced a final question, one meant to cool the temperature. "What do you hope viewers take away from this conversation?" His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone attempting to land a plane in heavy turbulence. Stallone leaned forward slightly, his gravelly tone warm but unyielding. "That conversation matters," he said. "That disagreement isn't danger, it's proof we're still free to speak." The line settled over the room like a closing bell, prompting a standing ovation from pockets of the audience, despite the stage manager's desperate attempts to cue silence. By the time the cameras faded to commercial, the outcome was undeniable. Stallone had turned a routine promotional spot into a live lesson on authenticity, and the host, who set the trap, now found himself part of the very story he had tried to control. By the time evening newscasts rolled around, the morning interview had already morphed into a global talking point. Cable networks replayed the most charged moments on a loop, each outlet adding its own slant. Some praising George for asking the tough questions, others celebrating Stallone's unwavering stance as a triumph of free expression. Entertainment shows spliced together reaction shots of the audience, highlighting the spontaneous bursts of applause that defied network protocol. Memes flooded every platform. One showed Stallone wearing a superhero cape captioned, "The real Spider-Man," quote. Another froze George's surprised expression with the tagline, "When the script flips live on air." Late-night comedians rushed to incorporate the showdown into their monologues, framing it as proof that morning television could still deliver more drama than primetime reality shows. Meanwhile, political commentators debated the deeper implications. Was this a celebrity overstepping his lane, or a citizen exercising rights long taken for granted? Within 24 hours, the segment's online clips had surpassed millions of views, trending simultaneously in entertainment and political categories. Fans flooded Stallone's social pages with messages of support, while George's team released a carefully worded statement praising spirited dialogue without admitting defeat. The interview that began as a simple promotional stop had become a cultural flashpoint, proving once again that a single, unscripted moment can outshine months of planned publicity and remind audiences that live television remains the most unpredictable arena of all. Days later, the shockwaves from that morning exchange were still rippling across headlines, podcasts, and dinner table debates. What had started as a routine publicity stop had crystallized into a cultural marker, a reminder of how quickly the boundaries between entertainment, politics, and personal conviction can dissolve under the unforgiving lens of live television. Commentators marveled at how Stallone's calm defiance managed to feel both rebellious and responsible, a rare balance in an era where every word is clipped, shared, and judged within seconds. Analysts dissected George's strategy, some arguing he misread the audience's hunger for authenticity, others suggesting he intentionally created a combustible moment to jolt a complacent format. For viewers, the details mattered less than the sensation of watching something undeniably real unfold in a space usually devoted to safe chatter. Stallone himself offered no follow-up interviews, posting only a short message on social media. Great conversation. Freedom means never being afraid to talk. The post went viral, amplifying the narrative that he had walked into a trap and walked out with the crowd. Meanwhile, morning shows across networks quietly re-examined their playbooks, wondering if they too should embrace unscripted risk to capture the lightning that Stallone had unleashed. In the end, the encounter left a permanent mark on both men's public images. George as the host who tested a legend and lost control, and Stallone as the veteran who proved that authenticity, when wielded with patience and precision, is still the most powerful punch in the ring. What lingered long after the studio lights cooled wasn't a winner or loser, but the unmistakable thrill of witnessing truth slip past carefully drawn boundaries. Sylvester Stallone hadn't stormed the set or shouted down his host. He'd simply refused to surrender the right to speak with clarity, showing that composure can land harder than any theatrical outburst. George Stephanopoulos, a veteran of political arenas, discovered that the very unpredictability he sought could cut both ways, turning a planned ambush into a case study in the limits of control. Viewers across the spectrum drew their own lessons. Some celebrated a Hollywood legend standing firm, others applauded a journalist for pressing difficult questions, but nearly everyone agreed on one point. The encounter felt real, in a media landscape often starved for authenticity. Clips continued to circulate, not because of scandalous revelations, but because the exchange captured something elemental about free expression in a hyper-connected age. Stallone's quiet defiance, George's calculated persistence, the audience's spontaneous reactions all fused into a single unscripted moment that reminded millions why live television still matters. It was more than an interview. It was a demonstration that courage and conversation remain the most powerful forces in any arena, whether lit by studio lamps or the unforgiving glow of a global feed.